Welcome to my humble abode, darlings. Come in out of the rain and get comfortable. I have a story to tell you, and I hope you enjoy. If you do, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. The Urban Fae, Prince of Griffins, Part 1. Serpentine had already hated Tyree for being a rival. He hated anyone not of his kind and under his heel, especially his powerful neighbor. He and Tyree were natural rivals, and freedom-loving wolves just don't care for tyrannical, reptilian avians, and vice versa. Slights and insults mounted over decades, as simple as that. Frida explained as she treated my wounds. It was a way to pass the time and avoid thinking of pain and weakness, while she put me on the road to robust health. I'd been asking about her people and world, but somehow she'd guided me to a conversation closer to my own home. Those gnomon, almost as reticent as dwarves about their history and culture. In this case, I felt like she was trying to provide some perspective for my near future. After all, pretty much everybody knew my family history, the gory details better than I did. Despite learning some cool skills and gaining some information through grandfather's fireside chats, I still had plenty to learn. I played along. She was my dear friend, after all, and I genuinely respected her privacy. Besides, I'd learned the easy way what happens to snitches and sneaks who press to know more than they should. I'd watched what Sony's crew had done to one of them. Grotesque didn't quite cover it. So I shifted gears. The rage increased my strength and spread, but did nothing for my skills. I thought maybe the direct body-to-body blows are what did for him, even though he was stronger. Exactly. What Serpentine feared was the personal contact. There were reasons why Fae in some societies remain aloof from direct contact with others. It is an extreme expression of the introvert versus extrovert scale, manifested in the physical realm. He was a being of seething anger and contempt. Your rage was a burst of fire from within a furnace. Your light was not unlike the one between the dragons, one broiled with sun rays, the other blasted from furnace fire from a heart's forge. Earth fire versus sky fire. I'd always enjoyed listening to her, like a big sister, but tiny, at least in stature. Her heart was gigantic. She smiled and secured a final bandage. These would keep the unigents and salves she applied from staining my bedding. It wouldn't have mattered. The blankets would have cleaned themselves, but I might bleed on them, and they could not self-clean their owner's blood. Besides, there was venom in the Kelpie's wound. That was part of his desperation to end matters quickly, and while he was able to disguise it, he probably felt weaker and more vulnerable than he had in centuries. She raised a finger. Before you ask, Goodrich is immune. She grinned, and the interior of the tent glowed. He's proud of the trophy he collected. Kelpie hides are beautiful, and the head will look magnificent mounted in his triumph room. She tucked me into my bedroll like some of my more decent fosters had done, occasionally. Sleep now, young chieftain. I have many more to aid. We should be able to head back to Wolf Castle day after tomorrow. Some of the long-lived may have to remain here to recuperate a little longer, but my team will do what we may for them. With that, she bustled out of my pavilion. When the Mactier Moor and I finally caught up with our individual tales, he told of why he had been delayed and what his and other parties had done. The drones had been in place as arranged by our mortal allies. The Kitsune clan and their mortal servants had ensured that they were properly programmed. That part had gone well, and we would own Kitsune Rede another debt. I wondered briefly what she would exact from us. More than I'd wanted, I glumly assumed. Starkvarm had taken the bait and stormed from his lair in literal hot pursuit. Grandfather had waited at the lakeside in Mundania to connect the portals on his own, then disconnected them and cast the gateway led by him to our clan Alpha. He'd learned the value of Mundanian wireless communication when it came to timing, since the Kitsune had let him know precisely when to connect the aerial portal with the underwater one. In the meantime, the remainder of Serpente's mundane forces attacked. They had been set to watch and gathered when they detected a Fey battle group. However, they had not counted on Fey ability in Mundania, and had ultimately lost the struggle after inflicting heavy casualties with their modern firepower. I enjoyed the gadgets we used. I would not have thought it possible, Grandfather rumbled. We could have used the beings of other worlds in their stead, but they would have died in similar number to the destroyed drones, a much more significant loss. We must ensure that Shane Gosling and his mortal employers are decently compensated for their losses. Perhaps connecting him with the Kitsune Rede will pay part of the debt we owe to each. Everyone in the mortal group had been directed by Glamours to properly recall the losses of their equipment. I want to find a way to properly reward Shabil as well. He's a longtime friend, and while we have differing views on the value of Mundania and its denizens, I like to reward my friends almost as much as I love to wreak havoc on my enemies. We shared a smile as well at the sentiment. He has been our staunch ally among the Fae. He seems to like you. While his music is unsophisticated compared to that of the Fae, it is nice as far as Mundanian arts go, often fitting for what we do in that world, and the two of you have used it to bond, not to mention your nefarious enterprises from the recent past. He winked. I was thinking of offering him some land and a holdfast in my realm, perhaps near the crossroads, or maybe a split between you and me. I nodded. Absolutely. I'd love to have him as a neighbor, even part-time. Maybe we can feel him out on what he would appreciate more. Grandfather beamed. He understood that motivating others required finding out what drove them and using it to guide them. The heart of leadership to his mind. By considering what Shabil would want instead of what I'd think to offer, I'd displayed that I'd learned that quality. From observing him, that is. The easy way. Your short friends and your fawn squad have been quite heroic. And your wolf guard and charioteer, his team, all of your chosen warriors have done excellent work. Of course, we have to find a way to thank Goodrich. He has the kelpie head to mount in his hall and the hide for a mantle or a wall hanging, but he engaged in that battle and took wounds on our behalf. Perhaps a tower in your castle? He paused, then added deadpan. Perhaps a saddle? I bit my lip to avoid laughing. I greatly enjoyed it when the big bad wolf was in a good mood. It happened, more than one would think. I truly owed my cousin a tremendous debt. I was thinking of a knighthood to go with the tower. The Griffin Knight sounded pretty cool. We discussed details of my holding and what I could share out to the entire team prior to the final disposition by the powers. If Serpente's realm turned out to be part of Otherworld rather than a separate world, it would bode well for me taking possession and ruling it. I told the truth. I wasn't seeking such a thing, but the Mactyr Moor encouraged me to take as much as I could. You have made a glorious start to your life, he told me. You are so young to have achieved so much. Yet in time you will want to settle and rule. The more you obtain in these early years, especially in reputation, the better position you will have when it comes to time to take a break and enjoy it all. It will elevate your position and help you avoid some fights. Possessions of a grandeur realm will invite others to attack or steal, but you will be all the more powerful in your response. It took quite a while to hash out the awards, rewards, and to design a legal defense for the Else Erig incident. During the discussions, we both continued to heal. I now had some impressive scars. They would fade. It was the nature of high fae that even honorably gained blemishes to our appearance were not permanent. I determined that on my next trip to Mundania, I would photo the scars so that I recall them and how to avoid their like in the future. I would have to go there sooner rather than later. My geisa spoke to me, and I felt the impulse to complete my quest. Nor did I know that the ultimate fate of Sony. He was a goof and a turd and often a pain in my arse, but I'd given him plenty of bidness over the years when I was a gangland courtier. His payment alone had funded my limited college work. Besides, despite everything, I'd always liked the OG. It was fun to internally rag on him. It meant that I liked him more than I detested him. Shabil/Skittle gave me my first real break in Mundanian criminal enterprises, and members of his crew had introduced me to many others and opened the door with Sony and his bunch. I understood the whys and wherefore these days, but it was hard to recall that the two names belonged to the same man. It wasn't simply a matter of basic appearance, but rather bearing. Shabil ensured that he played the role of a leader of both worlds. However, in Otherworld, he was larger than life, and a legendary warrior of the Leopard clan. In Mundania, he played the Skittle role, with the quiet dignity born of competence. He clearly cared for the people of his block. I needed to ask him, but I believed I'd come up with a proper reward. He had likely already considered it. He knew he was good. When I finally set out to address my geisa obligations, I took the wolves and fawns, but left the gnomon and their ponycorns in charge of constructing under Roar and Frida back home. My first real home that belonged to me. The dwarves stayed on too, and eyed the place with an unusual type of avarice, one that involved a lust for building and making the work a piece of art. They would in many ways own what they built. Wealth was different among the Fae and related beings. Killing Stark Farm had gained me a special status among them, so I had to take part in a ceremony and lay the cornerstone on the northeastern boundary of the structure, something that seemed familiar and was perhaps part of a wider tradition. I left Garen in charge of building facilities for stables and other creature structures. MB insisted on being my mount, boon companion, and comic relief. I think he may also have wanted to seek out some more Mundanian mares. Stallions are lecherous creatures, after all. First, I cleared the geisa with my final mortal foster. The old Hearn was sitting up in his recliner when I walked in to see him. He looked up and tried to suppress a grin. He was a friendly sort, and I was glad to see that some of his old manner had returned since he'd lost his missus, the redoubtable Miss Molly. Though he still looked older than his years and worn, there was no need to suppress my feelings. I took out Serpente's preserved melon and set it on the floor at his feet. As promised, sir, this one caused us both immeasurable pain. Not even taking this trophy will heal us, but now we know he can't go on causing harm. He nodded, sagely of course. It's who he was. You did well, Rob. I'm proud of you. I've expected to hear of your demise for some time now. I was surprised and of course happy to instead learn that you had conquered a great being of the High Fae. You are correct. We will feel empty for a while. After all, nothing changed for those we love. Give it time. He talked for a while, and as I was taking my leave, we shook hands. Despite the experiences of the previous couple of years, for the first time it felt like I was doing so as a grown man. Oh, by the way, I hope you enjoyed your 19th birthday. He winked. He knew from our discussions of my adventures that I hadn't even realized it had come and gone. Maybe I'll stop for cake and ice cream. I smiled to myself. Somehow, individual annual events lost some significance when compared to the unfolding of immortal eons. Next was the visit to Sony. He'd somehow managed to remain alive, but comatose. Familiar territory, my mind insisted. Even while ambulatory, he was comatose. I smiled. He looked more peaceful, though dreadfully emaciated. No more Big Daddy role for him. No more role at all. It was clear. James maintained a watch on the old man's room, even though his crew had been decimated in the dragon storm. I met one of the newer members, one Zevon, a lean whipcord of a man with empty shark eyes. He turned out to be friendly enough when I introduced myself, at least in the way that sociopaths can fake it. He assured me that James and many of the crew had indeed survived because of my warning. Some of the local leaders had fried, and I caught the feeling that he was okay with that, as was James. It had made it easy for their crew to round up the leftovers and seize control of all of Sony's block and a few smaller ones beside. I left Sony's side and imagined him one last time, perched in his ridiculous chair, wearing his goofy shades indoors, and trying to present a cool front. He'd been a character, and I was glad I'd known him. Afterwards, I met with Shabil. He liked my idea and had agreed that I could fund it, since we both had strong ties to the local community. What Lieutenant Falk refers to as hood rats. I'd learned that gold had value on most worlds, even those that didn't use currency, with which I was familiar. I had not yet presumed my claim to the holdings on Griffin Home. I was sure I would have something coming from inheritance. I'd probably have to serve the royals first. The otherworld plane had plenty, so in those realms, gold was valued more for its appearance than as money. Here in Mundania, it was still a precious commodity, and I had lots at my disposal. We teamed up to repair Sentinel Park and its environs. It would be part of his block and under his protection. If anyone had any arguments, we would call up resources to respond to their concerns, as in, stomp their guts for messing with my bro. He could handle himself, but had been distracted with otherworld matters, and now needed to reinforce his will. We made the block as allies and had fun with the glamours and the stereo systems on his leopard-drawn chariot. Everyone found additional respect for Skittle and his underworld connections. He was pals with an classic organized crime boss, maybe a high-dollar hitman, or so anyone assumed from my appearance and demeanor. Gossip can be very useful, especially when initiated with intention. Shabil finally introduced us to his mate. Not every being referred to their significant other as husband or wife. She was quite lovely, and their 2 kids were fun, cute and rambunctious, only mildly destructive, as toddlers of most species can be. They remained primarily in their homeworld, but visited Mundania occasionally. Shabil looked after mortals out of interest mingled with a mild form of pity for their numerous inadequacies, like pets or zoo animals. It was a fun visit, with 2 small fayed children clinging to my legs as I walked around, all the while engaging in a getting-to-know-you conversation with their mother. She must have liked me on some level, since she let the kids use me as an animated toy. I dealt with many younger foster siblings, and in a couple of residents, I was a full-time caretaker while their parents focused on what they could do with their kid check money. For some reason, little kids and I got along well. For my part, it was their brutal honesty, and often to seem like intentional, dark-edged humor. For theirs, maybe they sensed something in my nature, and that the fact that I was more likely to defend them than to bully them, and that I had energy to allow them to treat me as a toy on occasion. It seemed odd to me that the Fae had met, who were married, did not always seem to stay with their spouse, mates, or whatever they chose to call the arrangements, on an everyday basis. With immortality a factor, I suppose it would get tiresome, and absence would make the heart grow fonder. Fae perceived time differently. Maybe it was just the odd perception of time, I thought, hoped. And maybe Sorsha and I could do something like that. Maybe I could become a Selkie and hang out with her as a seal. Grandfather had warned me about water as an element. It had caused me much indirect harm, and Sorsha had saved me from it when mixed with dragonfire. Maybe the allure of the element is what he meant. Maybe because a sea voyage had led to my parents' eventual deaths. Maybe because I'd tempted to turn all the way so that I could be with my love. My heart was still pretty brittle and led my mind into deep waters, pun intended. My last stop on the Geisa tour was to visit the Goslings. That's when things went sideways. And not just because the house was weird. I can't seem to go too far along without a visit from my old buddy Fubar. I'd always felt that there was something special about the ramshackle but very nice construction. Something special about the ramshackle but very nice structure. Several beings had made reference to it being a puzzle house. I knew that there was a portal somewhere on the property that led to Cat Home. Mostly I knew it as the place my Sorsha called home in her childhood. So for me, it was sacred ground. I recalled that I should see and look through any glamours or glooms. There was a strong one around this place, the strongest I had encountered. It took real concentration to penetrate it. No locals or casual observers would have a clue. I saw that the front door was askew, still connected by one hinge, but as soon as I approached it, I saw that there was other damage to the front entrance of the home where I'd resided briefly. The wolves conducted an olfactory reconnaissance and reported that they could detect no current enemies, but that a party had been present recently. At least that's what I felt they were telling me. MB nickered uneasily and shuffled about, looking and listening in all directions. The fawns, who had terrific visions, conducted their own search and insisted on checking for traps before I entered. There were 5 of them left, fewer than half of the original team. They'd become my second shadows. Bidiao reported back that it was safe for me to proceed into the front room, but he warned, "There are signs of violence, chieftain. Blood and other matter splattered across the interior. I know that you care for the occupants. We have not yet identified them, but if they are here, they are likely deceased." He hung his head, not in fear of my response, but with care of my feelings. "Thank you, Piato. I am steeled and remain so with my faithful fawns and warding wolves." He said nothing more, but I detected a hint of pride and salacious feelings in his demeanor. I'd developed some of the skills of reading the body language of several quasi-anthro beings and many of the other varieties of beings and creatures. I was learning how to live within my birthright. We left MB in the yard and followed the blood trail that led through the odd twisting corridors and rooms that appeared from around the corners and dead-end passages. It came to a halt in a hallway I recognized as one of the containing the library and the private rooms of the Gosling family. I opened the one that had belonged to the once happy couple. There would be no need to continue the glamour for Miss Ellie. Her shredded remains decorated the abattoir that had been her bedroom. The core had been decomposing for some time, and a wave of nausea struck me from the stench. I was able to identify only one portion of her anatomy, her head, skewered onto a bedpost, staring directly into my eyes. Imagine my surprise when her gaping mouth began to move, and words emitted from her literally disembodied voice, slightly hoarse and dry. "No more secrets. I know who and what you are. I know that one of my daughters was a changeling. Your kind brought me to this end, loving Croesus and our children, then Sean and his daughter. All of you placed blinders on me, deceived me. You are all servants of the devil, and I reject and abjure thee. You killed my true daughter and cut my son from the memory of his true family. You and your friend of wife shall never again find happiness. You shall never again hold one another. Any miracle you seek will fail. So, I curse you! I didn't absorb much of the information as I likely needed. I was stunned to have a corpse head with a familiar face speaking at me. I decided to go with it. Faye, go figure. Though I ended up babbling a bit. What happened to you, Ellie? Who did this to you? Is Shane okay? The mouth cackled. She could no longer toss back her head or contort her features, which was creepy in its own way. The globe and bone and rotting flesh simply sat stiffly and responded. You have asked all three of your allotted questions. So here are your three allotted answers. I was decapitated and then cut into pieces for you to find. Slatin Love did it. Shane is okay as far as I know. She cackled again, and then her countenance froze for a moment. It fell into a slack expression, frozen for a moment, relaxed only as dead flesh could, and remained forever still. The sardonic laughter was nearly the last thing I ever heard. The tableau had frozen us long enough for another party to spring their ambush. A huge figure leaped from the closet and thrust a long-bladed axe, mounted on a pole, towards my face. It was hard to see the object coming straight on the way, and still harder to dodge it. I didn't really. I stumbled back a pace and tossed back my head the way Ms. Ellie no longer could, even under the unnatural unlife she'd been briefly granted. I caught a nasty gash on my chin and saw stars from the impact. I heard noises as other beings and creatures pressed the attack, but I had my hands full defending against Milion, who had nearly added my head to his collection. Perhaps he'd intended to mount it next to Ellie's on another bedpost. I found my feet and began the battle dance. I used the short sword and claw in the close quarters. I managed to activate the diadem helmet. I was already clad in mail armor. The large being thrust again, this time at my midsection. I made him pay for that. I twisted aside and he leaned in too far, hoping for a quick kill. Instead, he roared in pain and fury when he lost two of his clawed fingers. That's for wrecking my chin dimple, I thought. My thoughts intruded unhelpfully. I found that Pietro and I were arranged almost back to back. I hoped that the noise outside the room were the rest of my minions fleeing to safety. My opponent was angry, but had to step back for a moment to tend to his injuries. It didn't matter. Two Miniloenesses took his place, each armed with short, Asiage-style spears. A third and two young-looking minotaurs hung back, waiting their turn in the close quarters. In the meantime, Pidio fended off a trio of quasi-coyotes backed by another trio of coyotes, as big as Mundanian Arctic wolves. For the moment, the close quarters worked to our advantage. However, I saw that we would soon tire, and they could simply switch places when fatigue struck. Or they were injured and wearing us down until they were able to properly swarm us. I realized that the best approach would be to kill some of our enemies, usually a good plan in struggles to the death. It might even discourage the survivors. Probably not, my mind crowed. Probably just make them madder. Didn't truly stop Lion O back there by the chimney licking his stubs. I was able to get in a good gut wound on one of the lion chicks. She stepped back and a young lion dude stepped in to replace her. I blocked the other Mino lioness's attack and dodged past the initial thrust from the young fellow. Then I used the claw to slit his throat. That gained me a full 2 seconds to catch my breath and assess the situation. I saw that the Murphy had finally come to collect. There were plenty of opportunities, and only a handful of us to resist them. The futility gave me the first stirrings of the rage. I'd begun to flush and foam, a little embarrassing, the foaming at the mouth bit, when a tremendous, vibrating roar sounded. It was old 8-fingered Zlatinlaf, the beast. His forces broke off the attack and withdrew into the shadows from whence they'd sprung. I detected scrambling forms that rushed in from outside the room, and the entire mess swirled and faded. In their place sat the most welcoming figure, Tom Tildrum, King of the Cats. So quoth this raven. Thank you for listening, my darlings, and I hope you have a wonderful 4th of July weekend, in case I don't get another story out besides this one this week. So, there's that. Thank you for stopping by, my darlings. It means so much. I so enjoy telling these stories for you. And here are some of my marvelous supporters. Please, if you haven't subscribed, consider doing so. If you give this video a like, it would help me out ever so much. Thank you, and have a lovely, lovely day.